I'm Darrel Moellendorf, Professor of International Political Theory and Philosophy at Goethe University, Frankfurt. I prefer to do this in English. You've heard my German. It's much easier for me to talk about philosophy in English. If you held a gun to my head, I would do it in German, but I would not enjoy it. So thank you for allowing me to speak to you in English. So this is, I want to talk to you a little bit about a book that I've published recently called Mobilizing Hope, Climate Change, and Global Justice. And I was meant to bring flyers for the book that had a little promotional code so that you could buy it at a discount, and I left them home. So if you're interested in the book, I can't offer you a discount, but you can go to the Oxford University Press webpage and buy it directly from them without a discount. So I'm sorry about that. So the idea of the book is to talk about the, as the subtitle says, climate change and global poverty, to talk about the ways in which it's important to think about the problem of global poverty when thinking about climate change. So in part to talk about how these are related, not just related causally, but related morally. Why, if one's morally concerned about poverty and one's morally concerned about climate change, one has to think about them together. But also, as the title suggests, to consider the reasons that we have to hope that an adequate solution to climate change can be found, given all of the things that are, I think, very anxiety-inducing about climate change, right? Very worrying about climate change. I'm as worried as anybody about climate change. I'm not here to tell you that everything's okay, but I do think that there are grounds to be hopeful. And I think that it's important to try to maintain hope, because I think there's a connection between hope and developing positive action, and indeed building opposition to the current politics. So that's the thought. That's what I'll try to talk to you about. I like this quotation from Ernst Bloch. Ernst Bloch, many of you probably know, is a German philosopher who wrote a 3-volume book called The Principle of Hope. And those aren't, by the way, American colors. I am American, but those are the colors of the Fridays for Future group, and it indicates cool to hot, right? It's a temperature grade. Ernst Bloch, in the book Principle of Hope, has an attitude towards social events which emphasizes the possibility of openness, the possibility that change is never foreclosed. And I think that this quotation is very nice in this regard, particularly when we think about the environmental challenges of the coming decades. For the world itself, just as it is in a mess, right, terrible condition, is also in a state of unfinished and experimental process out of that mess. So there's a thought that there's always the possibility, if it's a human-created mess, right, if it's not constrained by geophysical features, which of course aspects of the climate situation are, but if it's a human-created mess, there's a way out. There's always a way out, and it's a matter of trying to find the way out and mobilizing the political resources, the political and social resources to get out. So I'll talk first just very briefly about the climate crisis, then I want to talk about the problem of global poverty, the right to promote sustainable development, which is the moral connection between the problem of poverty and climate change, or one of them. Why it is that we're failing to adequately address the problem. Talk a little bit about the idea of international solidarity, which I think is deeply important. And then finally, hope at the end. All right, so there was a report by the World Meteorological Association organization last year that kind of gave us the current summary of the state of climate, and it noted that in 2020, which is now 3 years ago, the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere had reached a level of 413 parts per million. Okay, that's an abstract figure and it may not mean much to you, but the thing to do is to compare it to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere just prior to the Industrial Revolution. And at that point it was 279 parts per million. So we're getting ever closer to the point of doubling the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And of course, this is what's driving climate change. The same report noted that the last 7 years, from 2015 to 2021, were the warmest years on record, since humans have been keeping records, right? That the global mean sea level had reached new high proportions of 4.5 millimeters above the pre-industrial levels. So as the atmosphere warms, right, the sea levels expand, or water expands, that increases the sea levels, but also at the same time, there's melting of fresh water, glaciers that pour eventually into the ocean and raise it even more. Ocean acidification is a big problem because oceans are one of the ways in which CO2 finds its way, cycles its way back down to the earth, and ocean acidification is higher than it's been remarkably in 26,000 years. And this is terrible for ocean ecology, right? Because ocean acidification significantly damages, for, among other things, coral reefs. And coral reefs are one of the treasures of biodiversity in the ocean. You probably know this, but last summer was the hottest summer on record in Europe, since we've been keeping records. It was the hottest, not on record, but the hottest since the 1540 mega drought in Europe. So we're going through a remarkable period of warming in Europe. But of course, it's much worse in other places. So there was this terrible flooding that happened in Pakistan, 500% more precipitation than on average, higher than in 30 years. 33 million people were displaced and over 1,000 people died in Pakistan. The situation is actually even worse in Madagascar, although we don't hear much about it, but hundreds of thousands of people were facing climate change-induced drought in Madagascar in 2021. And I mentioned those two countries because the focus of a lot of what I want to say, at least in this first part of this talk, is on the relationship between climate change and poverty, global poverty. So poverty can be measured in many different ways. Poverty isn't a single thing, right? Poverty is actually a theoretical construct, and it can be measured in many different ways depending upon the normative definition that one has for poverty, and then one needs a definition, and then one sets about to try to measure the condition of people to see whether or not they're in that normative definition. One of the ways to measure poverty is in terms of energy. There's a concept called energy poverty. And energy poverty has to do with whether or not people have access to electricity on the one hand, and whether they have access to modern cooking fuels on the other hand. So there's sort of two metrics for energy poverty. 1.4 billion people in the world still live without electricity. And if you consider what that means, right, that means that they don't use electric stoves, right? They don't have computers at home typically. They don't have lighting for their children to do their schoolwork. They may have trouble going to a nearby hospital in which there's electricity in the hospital to perform operations. Employment, of course, large factories require electricity, employment that is going to be much more informal and is going to be much more located around agricultural or other informal ways. So access to electricity is a marker of an impoverished condition. More significantly, perhaps, is that 2.7 billion people lack access to modern cooking fuels. And so that means that they gather things to burn in their homes to cook. They gather wood, or they gather animal dung, and they cook that at home. And that in and of itself may not sound so terrible, but it turns out that it's actually very bad for one's health, because the indoor pollution that's caused as a result of that is productive of a number of childhood respiratory diseases. Children suffer dramatically from that. And the gathering of the stuff that should be burned is very dangerous in many areas of the world. Young children and women are oftentimes attacked and physically assaulted in the process of gathering the materials to cook. So energy poverty is a scourge on human well-being. It's one of the aspects of poverty that most needs to be addressed. And more than that, it's connected in general to the problem of poverty and to the persistence of poverty. There's well-documented studies now that show that as countries make gains in human development, their energy use also increases dramatically. Now, when I talk about human development, I don't just mean that more money is being made or that people are becoming wealthier or have better income. Human development is actually another measure, another technical term, and it's used by the United Nations Human Development Program, and it consists of 3 indices. One of them is income. One of them is whether or not a person's income is increasing. But the other 2 are health. Health attainments are part of human development, and education is the third. So human development is measured then in terms of income, in terms of health attainments, and in terms of education. And countries that are then highest on the human development indices are the countries in which people are the wealthiest, the healthiest, and the best educated. And as I said, it turns out that as countries make progress on the Human Development Index, they use much more energy. So I'll point to you 2 very dramatic and remarkable instances of this. The first is China. The human development progress that's been made in China since the 1990s is unprecedented. It's world historical. The West doesn't even compare to China in this regard, doesn't even compare. So in 1990, the Human Development Index of China was 0.499, 1 being the highest, and so they were halfway down. That's a sort of fairly low level of medium human development, as it turns out. And they consumed 0.51 megawatts per person. Again, these are just numbers, but what you'll see is what's important is comparing them to the future. So 25 years later, China had moved up into the higher level of human development, and they had done so by increasing their electricity consumption 8-fold. 8-fold, right? There's a similar story to be told about Thailand, not quite as impressive, but you can see that they were at a similar sort of level, slightly more energy consumption, and then in 2015 they had also made significant gains, and they had done so by increasing their energy consumption also very significantly. So why is this important from the perspective of climate change? Well, there's 2 major challenges that face the world. There's more than 2, but there's 2 that are connected, right? One is achieving net zero CO2 emissions, right, as quickly as possible. If we want to hold the temperature warming to 1.5 degrees, which is one of the internationally recognized goals, then we need to achieve net zero carbon emissions by the middle of this century, right? 30 years from now, 27 years from now. If we want to achieve 2 degrees warming not higher than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, then we need to achieve net zero 15 to 20 years after that, right? By the second half of this century. That's one major goal for humanity. The other major goal for humanity, if we take the problem of poverty seriously, is a massive increase in energy consumption in the developing world, as these numbers indicate, right? You don't get to higher levels of human development without massively increasing energy consumption. And of course, I mean, how did China and Thailand do it? They did it by burning coal. So you could see, if I had the figures on the slide, which I don't, but you would see that the increase in CO2 consumption was, in the case of China, 8-fold, right? All of that electricity comes from the burning of coal. So at the same time that we have to move away from fossil fuels, we also have to dramatically increase the consumption of electricity. And that is a major challenge. I'm not here to tell you it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible. But I think it affects how we think about the morality of the situation, which is what I want to talk to you about next. So in the treaty language that governs international negotiations on climate change, the treaty itself is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. In this treaty, there's language that explicitly recognizes the problem of development and the need to overcome poverty. And the treaty recognizes the right to promote sustainable development. In Article 3, Paragraph 4, it says the parties, that is the member states, the states that are a party to the treaty, the member states have the right to and should promote sustainable development. This is put into the treaty at the insistence on low and medium income countries who knew that if they were going to develop, right, they were going to need to increase their energy consumption, and they didn't want a climate change mitigation treaty to constrain their efforts to do that. So they were keen to have that in there. And I think that the way to think about what this means, to say that a state has the right to promote sustainable development, is to say that states are at liberty, right? They're at liberty to promote national development plans that will allow them to increase their level of human development. That whatever happens within a climate change negotiation regime, right, within a treaty to achieve net zero, has to respect the liberty of states to continue to pursue human development. Now, of course, that's just the development part. It's not the sustainable part, right? It's the right to promote sustainable development. And so how does that fit together with sustainability? I think it fits together with sustainability only if the other states develop a framework which allows the promotion of human development to be done sustainably without a cost to the prospects of human development for the member states. So I take this to be, and now we're going to use a little bit of moral philosophical language here. I take this to be a fundamental aim of international justice, right? When states say that they have a right to promote sustainable development, they're making a claim of international justice. They're making a claim vis-a-vis other states, right? Saying that we're at liberty to do this, and if we're going to solve the problem of climate change, then we're going to have to solve it in a way that allows us to continue to pursue our liberty to develop. What would be the justification for this kind of a right? Again, being a philosopher, right, I'm interested in whether or not a claim to a right is something that can be justified, right? Is it just empty words? Well, I think that the most obvious reason to think that a right like this is justified is that this is fundamental to the project, the morally mandatory project of poverty eradication, right? If states are going to fulfill their obligations to their citizens and give them the opportunities to pull themselves out of poverty, then they have to be at liberty to pursue human development. It's part and parcel of being morally concerned about poverty. It's also, I think, just a matter of fairness. If you think about this as a collective international project, right? States coming together, dealing with a problem, trying to tackle a problem together, right? They need to tackle it on terms that are fair, right? They need to engage in a process that's fair to each state. And it would be unfair, I think, to place demands on developing states such that the pursuit of climate change mitigation could render them worse off than they might be absent the treaty itself. Absent the treaty itself, of course, they would suffer the ravages of climate change, right? That would also be terrible to their human development prospects. But if the treaty were also to constrain them in ways such they couldn't use energy and not develop, it's not clear that they would be any better off with the treaty than without it. It would look like the treaty is a matter of a certain form of colonialism, right? Preventing their development prospects. And then third and finally, I think we shouldn't underestimate just the very simple fact that states have signed this treaty, and in signing this treaty, they've signed on to the right to promote human development, the right to promote sustainable development. And in signing that, they've made a certain sort of promise, and the promise is then to allow other states to develop in such a way. So if any of the wealthy states of the world, the EU, the United States, Japan, Australia, were to say, no, sorry, in order to tackle climate change, you're going to have to forego your development agenda, that would be breaking a promise that they had made to the developing states at the time that they signed the treaty itself. So if you look at this then as a matter of international justice, right, part of what's fundamental to solving the problem of climate change is also then allowing low and medium income countries to continue to develop. That suggests something else that's really important morally, which is that the responsibility for solving the problem of climate change can't lie first and foremost on their shoulders. It can't harm their development prospects. So the second moral concept that I want to talk to you about, if the first is international justice, the second is the idea of responsibility. I think of responsibility and justice as two sides of the same coin. So justice are the claims that states have against other states. Responsibility is the way in which those other states have to answer those claims. Right? So justice and responsibility go together in that way. So I think if we take the right to sustainable development seriously as a matter of international justice, it suggests to us that the most highly developed states, the EU, right, the other European countries that aren't in the EU, North American states, Australia, Japan, that the burden has to lie on them first and foremost to ensure that there's a global energy regime that both achieves net zero and allows lesser developed states to continue to develop. That achieving that kind of regime, financing that regime, providing the technology for that regime, providing the organizational resources for that regime, that's the obligation of the wealthiest countries of the world. Any other way of assigning responsibility for it would possibly lay burdens on developing countries that would cause their prospects to develop to be diminished. So if we take the right to sustainable development seriously, I think responsibility follows, or the claim about responsibility that follows from that is that the wealthiest countries of the world have to be the ones that are responsible for providing the infrastructure, the financing, the technology to achieve net zero. And this view is also, as it turns out, captured in a way in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which in Article 3, they say the parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humanity on the basis of equity, but in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. It's that last bit, differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, right? Not all states are equally responsible for solving the problem. And what I'm arguing is that the way to best understand that is that the wealthiest, most highly human developed states bear the burden of responsibility. Okay, so I let you know in the beginning how bad things are, right? Things are not particularly in a good situation for us. It's not looking particularly good in terms of addressing the problem. And that raises the obvious question of what's going on, right? We know this. It's not as if, I mean, you know this more or less. You might not have known the particular facts that I gave you. Most of the people who read the newspaper or hear news are aware of this. We know that this is the nature of the problem. What is it exactly that we're waiting for? And what do I mean by we're waiting? Well, the United Nations Environmental Program publishes this document each year called the Emissions Gap. And last year, they said in their document that the world is still falling short of the Paris Treaty. The Paris Treaty was the treaty in 2015. The Paris Treaty goals to reach a credible pathway of 1.5 degrees centigrade, that we're not on a credible path to achieving 1.5 degrees. It's been now 7 years since Paris, and we still haven't gotten on track. It's actually not particularly good at all. With the current policies of all of the governments of the world who have signed the pledges in Paris, if they were to stay on track with their current policies, the world would warm by the end of the century 2.8 degrees. Right? That's a long ways from 1.5 degrees. It's even quite a ways from 2 degrees, as it turns out. If you take their current policies and the pledges that they've made, right, the promises that they've made unconditionally, not dependent upon what other people do, and if they were to follow through on the pledges, right? And you know, of course, if you've made a New Year's resolution, you know how hard it is to follow through on a pledge, right? But let's just assume the countries follow through on the pledge. The world would still warm 2.6 degrees more than at the pre-industrial level. A long ways above 2, even farther above 1.5. If you were to take all of the pledges they've made, and then also recently there's been a bunch of countries who have pledged to go net zero by certain dates. If you take all of that into effect, then we would hit 1.8 degrees by the end of the century. That's a little bit, that's better news. But of course, we're still talking about pledges, right? And it's going to be difficult for many countries to get on board to honoring the pledges. So what are we waiting for? Why are we moving at such a slow pace? The picture is indicative of what I take to be the problem. I think the major problem for public policy, for international agreements, is the influence of the fossil fuel industry. Why? Well, the fossil fuel industry's core business is to extract fossil fuels out of the ground, to refine them, to transport them, and then to have them be burnt at various places around the world. And as it turns out, there are far more fossil fuels in the ground today, far more, than can ever be extracted and burnt if we're going to hit the 1.5 or even the 2 degree level. And Shell Oil, Chevron, they know this, right? And so they have systematically for 2 decades engaged in misinformation campaigns, trying to convince people that climate change wasn't real. And then once they couldn't do that any longer, they tried to convince people that we didn't need to move as quickly as we needed to move. And then once they couldn't convince people of that any longer, they tried to convince people that, oh, it would be unfair if your country took on obligations when this country over here isn't taking on obligations. And when I say that they're doing this systematically, what I mean is that they have hired the very same advertising firms that tried to convince people 40 years ago that smoking wasn't dangerous to their health. The tobacco companies in the United States hired major advertising firms to try to convince Americans that smoking wasn't bad for their health. These very same advertising firms are being hired by the oil companies around the world to try to convince people that we don't need to go as quickly. Well, first of all, that it wasn't a problem, and now that we don't have to go as quickly as we need to, or gee, really there's a problem of fairness here, that we're gonna move more quickly than you. Major campaigns, public campaigns of that sort, but also major influence on the policies of countries around the world. The case that I know best is the case of the United States. And I will mention to you that during the second Obama administration, the Congress of the United States was in 2013-2015. It was the 113th Congress of the United States. There's good reporting to indicate that the fossil fuel industry in the United States spent $351 million giving money to people running for Congress, right? And as a result, Congress passed legislation in which the fossil fuel industry received $42 billion in benefits. So if you think about that $351 million as an investment, right? It paid off tremendously well. It affected the legislation in the United States such that fossil fuel industry saved $42 billion. There's a great webpage called Influence Map, and they've studied this matter. They studied the influence of the fossil fuel companies, and they held in 2016 that that the lobbying on the part of the fossil fuel industry involved spending on the order of $500 million annually. So they're spending lots of money to protect their investments in the extraction and the refinement and the burning of fossil fuels. That's their core business. And it's worse than this. So I refer to this in the case of the United States as the plutocratic tendencies in American democracy. Plutocratic means, right, the rule of wealth, right? This is an indication of the plutocratic tendencies in the American democracy. And the plutocratic tendencies are revealed in other ways in the US system as well. So for example, last year, there was a major Supreme Court case called West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency. And in this Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court justices found that the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the arm of the government in the United States, is supposed to protect the environment, right? Supposed to ensure that the problem of climate change is dealt with. The Supreme Court decided that they didn't have the authority to set certain levels of protection, and that instead was a matter of the Congress to do. And if you push it back to the Congress, that means it won't happen, right? Because the difficulty of getting a majority. Now, as it turns out, every single conservative justice on the Supreme Court that voted for that was a justice that during the course of their legal career was supported by a conservative organization called the Federalist Society. And where does the money for the Federalist Society come from? Anybody want to guess? The fossil fuel industry. So here's what I'm not suggesting. I'm not suggesting conspiracy, right? This isn't a conspiracy theory. That's not how plutocracy works, right? The way it works is that you have individual agents who have an interest in their investments working to pursue them, and many different people are doing that. But because these are powerful people, the influence is dramatic. It's not just in the United States, as it turns out. The depressing news is it's also internationally. So, at the last COP, there are these meetings, and once a year all of the states come together under the framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They're called Congress of the Party meetings. The last one was in Egypt. You might have heard of it, COP27. At that meeting, there were more representatives attending that meeting. These are supposed to be representatives of countries, right? Come together to talk about policy. There were more representatives of fossil fuel industries at that meeting than of the 10 most affected states by climate change. Right. Next year, this meeting, of all places, where is it going to take place? It's going to take place in the United Arab Emirates, a major fossil fuel producing country. And the president will be a president that's drawn from the United Arab Emirates, who is the head of their state oil company. This is where the next meeting of the international group that's supposed to be addressing the problem of climate change is going to happen next November. This is where it's going to take place. So it's just indicative of the influence of the fossil fuel industry on climate change negotiations that it's really hard to think about there being a dramatic breakthrough at a meeting that's taking place in one of the major oil producing countries in the world, right? Right. So that's, as I see it, the problem. That's what we're up against. Now, I've talked about the moral concept of justice. I've talked about the moral concept of responsibility. I want to introduce another concept. This is the concept of solidarity. And this is not exactly a moral concept. It's a kind of hybrid concept. Justice has to do, when we think about we have a reason for justice to do something, we mean that we owe it to somebody else, right? That somebody has a claim, right? And we're doing it for the sake of somebody else. And when we say it's in our self-interest, we mean, well, we're doing it because it's good for us. And solidarity is kind of in between those two perspectives, right? A perspective of solidarity is something that's good for all of us. It's not just good for them, it's not just good for me, but we stand in solidarity insofar as we're working together. We're solidly working together to promote something that's good for all of us. So international solidarity, I think, involves joint international action, right, in pursuit of something that is good for several or all states. Right? It's working together for the common good. And you can see how climate change mitigation can be thought of as a matter of international solidarity. Right? We have, around the world, people have a common interest in health and security that is served by having a stable climate system, right? We're all threatened by instability in the climate system around the world. Although people in Bangladesh and Madagascar might be threatened more, we're all threatened by that. So we have reason to work together, right? Reason to take solidarity with one another. We all have interests in health interests that have to do with the reduction of air pollution, right? CO2 is also is concomitantly associated with all kinds of respiratory ailments that people around the world suffer from. Ground pollution from the extraction of oil. Oftentimes it's indigenous people who suffer the most from the extraction. And people of various countries have an interest in the political independence that could be gained from being energy independent, right? Big problem with the current war is the fact that countries aren't energy independent. It makes it much harder to take a decisive stand, right, for Europe. So there are reasons of solidarity to think that this is a problem that we should be able to address. And that, I think, is good news, right? That we're not, the interests of people aren't pitted against each other, that we could all benefit from this. That's a reason of solidarity is a powerful reason to think that there's a possibility for change. What's often not appreciated, though, is it's not, I mean, those are sort of, I think, fairly obvious ways to think that the world would just be much better if we could achieve climate change mitigation. What's often not appreciated is that it would also be better from the perspective of employment. That climate change and that sort of green policy approach is not contrary to jobs. It's not contrary to the interests of working people broadly considered. In fact, there are far more jobs created by investment into renewable energy than there are created by investment into fossil fuels. There's been a fairly systematic study by an economist by the name of Robert Poland who showed that it's something on the order of, well, look at the three states sort of from the top there. These are all oil-producing states, Brazil, China, and the USA. And there are job gains on the order of anywhere from 75% to 135% in an economy that would move to renewable energy. Renewable energy just turns out to be much more labor-intensive, the nature of the production of it, than fossil fuels. And in countries that are primarily energy importing, like Germany, there'd be a tremendous increase because all of the jobs would be domestically. Right? It wouldn't be in the production of and the refinement of the oil somewhere offshore. So the world would be, we would be safer from the disruptions of climate, right? We would be healthier from the lack of air pollution. We would have more international security, and there would be more employment in a green economy. Profound reasons to think around the world that we should be able to solve or work on this problem together. So robust climate change mitigation benefits almost everyone. It's a reason to think that solidarity is possible. Almost everyone, except the owners of fossil fuel companies and the banks that finance them. And that's the problem. That's what we're up against. Okay. I'm winding down. Searching for hope. So let me say, I'm going to move now to talk a little bit of what we in the business call moral psychology. I'm going to talk a little bit about my understanding of this idea of hope. But when I talk about hope, I don't conflate hope with optimism. Hope and optimism, I think, are not the same thing. So I think one can be hopeful and not optimistic. And I'll say why. In fact, I would say that I would describe my attitude as that. Vis-a-vis climate change. What do I mean by hope? I think hope is an attitude that people may have, and that it involves the readiness to pursue or promote some aim, right? Some outcome, some event, some state of affairs, right? To try to work towards it, to pursue it or promote it, because it's possible and because it's good. Right? When we're hopeful, we stand ready where possible. It's not always possible, but we stand ready to contribute to the production of something. Why? Well, because we think it's good and we think it's possible. So an optimistic person might say that it's not just possible, but that it's likely, right? Somebody who's optimistic about climate change might feel relatively confident that we can attain a solution to climate change within our lives. They might say, if you were to ask them to put a number on it, right, they might say, 75% likely, right? A hopeful person doesn't have to have that view, right? A hopeful person is somebody who thinks it's possible, but it's still worth working towards. That, I think, is the idea of hope. And the reason why I think hope is important from the political perspective, is because a person who's hopeful is a person who stands ready to contribute, stands ready to promote it. Hopefulness, a person who's hopeful is not somebody who thinks that, it'll just happen, right? Somebody who thinks that, who's complacent about it. A hopeful person is a person who stands ready to promote it, stands ready to pursue it. So if that's what hope is, when does it make sense to be hopeful, right? When can we say that hopes are well-placed, and when can we say that they're ill-placed? How do we evaluate when it's good to hope and when it's bad to hope, or it doesn't make sense to hope? Hope, I think, can be evaluated in two different ways. One way has to do with the fact that we hope for things that we think are likely, right? Part of the idea is that it's likely. I said it's good and that it's possible. So one of the ways that we can evaluate hopes and say that hopes are misplaced is if the thing that we're hoping for just seems so unlikely. So let me give you an example. Suppose I'm talking to my colleague, right? We're taking a coffee break. We're pouring coffee, and he's telling me how confident he feels about his retirement. He's got this plan for his retirement, and he's just sure that he's going to be living well in his retirement. He's got it all figured out. Of course, he's hoping for this, right? He's not sure. He's hoping for this. He's hoping that it's all going to work out. And I said, that's really interesting. Why are you so hopeful? And he says, well, I play the lotto every day. Right? And I think you want to say, I don't think you should be hopeful about your retirement if that's how you're planning for it. But the possibility of that working out for you is just so low. What is it? I don't know. It's 10 million to 1. I don't even know what it is. But the possibility is just so low that it doesn't make sense to have hope in that case. Now you might say, well, but why not, right? I mean, let him have his hope. And the problem is that there are, to use the language of an economist, that there are opportunity costs to hoping. Insofar as when you hope you stand ready to act, then there's things that you're not doing, right? Because he's playing the lottery, because he thinks that's the way he's going to get his retirement, then he's not saving any money, right? He's not putting money away in savings every month. So because when we hope for things, we stand ready to pursue it, we engage in certain kind of actions, we direct our attention towards it, it makes sense that there be some threshold of possibility. Otherwise, we may pursue things that we just, he really shouldn't be playing the lottery to save for his retirement. Another way to assess hopes is on their morality, on the morality of the object, right? There are some things we just shouldn't hope for, right? It's bad to hope for. The people who hoped for the victory of the South in the U.S. Civil War were wrongly hoping. You should not hope for the victory of the institutions of slavery. Right? What's wrong with that isn't that it's unlikely, right? What's wrong with that is it's morally reprehensible. So we can think about evaluating hopes in both of those ways, and And this then takes us to the case of climate change. I think we can clearly say that climate change is something that's worth hoping for, right? Climate change mitigation, dealing with the climate problem is morally commendable. We should be hoping, if it's sufficiently possible, we should be hoping for it. The issue is different, right? The issue with climate change is the likelihood. So I've said that hope involves a readiness to pursue a possible but uncertain good. So hope has this cognitive component, right? It has this component in which we assess the likelihood of something. The problem with my colleague was that he wasn't thinking carefully enough about how likely it was, right? That he was going to be able to retire well. So part of hoping has this cognitive component, and it's buttressed by evidence. And the evidence are what I call hope makers. So when we want to assess hope, we look for what I call hope makers. Hope makers are facts about the world. They can be facts about how social processes, how events develop. They can be theories of possible courses of action. They can be visions of a better world. Hope makers can be the actions of others, right? If other people are acting in a certain way, that can give us hope. We can be hope makers. Our actions can be hope makers to others. The problem with climate change depends first and foremost on the activity of people, right? It's not out of our hands. So each of us can be hope makers with respect to climate change, and each of us can draw hope from the actions of others. And so here I'm very strongly influenced by the writings of Martin Luther King Jr., talking about hope in the context of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. And King said of the students who were involved in the desegregation of lunch counters in the South, this was in about 1965, King wrote, "It's a movement based on a philosophy, the possibility of the future bringing into being something real and meaningful. It's a movement based on hope." And this idea that movements can be hope makers is something that I think is profound that we can take from King. King's known, of course, as a minister, right? He's known as a theorist of nonviolence. He's known as a theorist of civil disobedience. But it's not often appreciated that he was also the leader of a mass movement. He turned out hundreds of thousands of people over the course of several years to demonstrate on behalf of civil rights. And he was successful in certain ways. Right? There were two major pieces of legislation that were passed as a result of the mass demonstrations that he led. So mass movements, I think, are particularly important, and particularly important in the current context. And why is that? Well, if you think about the source of the problem is the influence that the fossil fuel industry has on government. And that goes back to their tremendous resources, right? It goes back to the money that they have, the capital that they have at their disposal to influence democratic politics. One of the best ways to counter that kind of power is through the power of people, right? Through the power of mass movements. And the civil rights movement in the United States is a good example of how when people are mobilized, things that look improbable can be successfully attained. So King, in talking about mass movements, says some things that I think are very interesting and worth our consideration. Our experience is that marches, right, mass demonstrations, must continue over a period of 30 to 45 days, right, sustained, 30 to 45 days. Think about the commitment that he's talking about to produce any meaningful results. They must also be of a sufficient size to produce some inconvenience. I like that sort of understatement, right? Some inconvenience to the forces in power, or they will go unnoticed. Part of the goal is to disrupt things a bit, right? That has to be part of the goal. Some inconvenience. If a method is not effective, no matter how much steam it releases, right? No matter how good people feel about being involved in it, if it's not effective, it's a waste of time, right? It's a sign, he says, of weakness, not of strength. So he has a very sort of disciplined attitude about what the project is. The project isn't for you to feel better after having gone and demonstrated for a day. The project is whether or not your demonstrating on this day leads next week to a bigger demonstration and to a bigger demonstration. So King is suggesting that people have to think very strategically about what builds mood. Don't do things just because it's going to make you feel good, right? Don't do things just because you're going to feel like you're in the vanguard if you do it, right? Do it because it's going to bring more people out next week and the next week and the next week. That's his view about it. So I think the most significant hope maker that we've experienced in the last 3 to 4 years in Germany and Europe and the United States are the demonstrations of young people through their various organizations. I think they've led the way, and the way forward is more of that. And I'll end just by one final, I started with a quotation of the Mayor's Block, I'll end with a quotation of the Mayor's Block, because I think it's remarkable how this quotation, I think, fits our present circumstances. The work against anxiety about life, anxiety about the future, right, about the climate, the work against anxiety about life and the machinations of fear, that work is work against its creators, the fossil fuel industry, right? Who are, for the most part, easy to identify. We know where the problem is. And it looks in the world itself for what can help the world. And this can be found, right? What can help the world is us. It's us using our capacity intelligently, our organizational acumen intelligently, and mobilizing effectively to address the interests that really are counter to all of us. That's the talk. And that's what the book looks like. If you want to know more, you can go to Amazon or you can go to OUP and read that book.